Um, so I'm in Nelson, BC, and working for the Ministry of uh, Forests. I think our name is changing again, so stay tuned coming up in the next few months. My specialty these days is pathology, but I did a lot of work in fire, and I'll show some examples of being out on some activity. We're going to talk about limber and whitebark pine. A lot of folks on this call are probably already familiar with these two species, so bear with me as I give a little intro. So I worked as a resource advisor, and that is in the USA, the Incident Command System. We don't have this position here in British Columbia, but I got to do that for 6 years in Oregon. And my graduate work also was focused on fire and forest health. So let's get going. Whitebark pine. This is a 5-needle pine, as is limber pine. It's a tree that generally occurs above 1,500 meters. It's very widely distributed in Western North America. It is a poor competitor with other trees. Typical co-dominants are Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir and lodgepole pine. It is very long-lived. There's a tree in Idaho, it's about 1,500 years old. That's the oldest known one. And very high ecological value, which I'll discuss in a moment, as well as cultural value. A couple of years ago, the Confederated Tribes hosted the annual meeting of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. And they hosted this down in Pablo, Montana, and took us out on a field trip where there is this very, very old snag out there. And I think folks there refer to this tree as the grandmother tree. So thanks to Mike Derglow for taking us out there and sharing your knowledge. A recent article in Archaeology magazine is documenting how native populations of people actually set up their villages in whitebark pine groves, and they've found residue of whitebark pine seeds in their pottery. And that came out in the last year. That's the Wind River Range of Wyoming. So yes, indeed, not only did people eat the seeds, but it's very important for wildlife as well. It's the largest seed up in the subalpine zone. And the cones, pretty cool cones. Lots of birds want at these seeds, but only one bird is able to actually open that cone. Mammals, lots of mammals eating these seeds as well. And that one bird is Clark's nutcracker. It has a very strong bill. It's the only nutcracker in North America, and it can open up these tightly closed cones and get the seeds out. And incidentally, they tend to take those seeds and bury them in the ground and come back and retrieve them later. There's even a book written about this. The Clark's nutcracker seems to have the best spatial memory of any vertebrate on the planet. It's really interesting what's going on with the nutcracker in whitebark pine. It also collects seeds from limber pine as well. And so here's some good photos of wildlife in whitebark pine habitat. The natural abundance of whitebark pine seeds varies from year to year. Some years we have no cone crop at all. And we've had research indicating that this natural fluctuation in cone crop affects grizzly bear reproduction. And so there's literature out there that you can find on this. And this is a pretty cool, if you can see my cursor moving around, we have a cone cage on here because we're collecting cones because we're going to test these for resistance to disease. We have to cage these cones because otherwise wildlife will get these cones. In this one tree up on Moiety Mountain near south of Cranbrook, we had a red squirrel, and there's a chipmunk as well, and there was a nutcracker dive bombing these guys, all trying to get to the seeds in, I think that was early September. Even foxes eat whitebark pine seeds, and this was recently revealed for Yellowstone. And here we have limber pine. So limber pine also fairly widely distributed, although it doesn't get up very far north in Canada. It's actually poorly understood, the distribution in British Columbia. Last week, we had a flight, Randy Moody and I, and we just 4 hours of flights, and we were able to increase the number of known occurrences of limber pine by 15%. It's the first helicopter reconnaissance I'm aware of. So I guess I'm not surprised that we were able to find some new populations, but the awareness is just so low for this tree in British Columbia and in Alberta as well, and probably most of the states. There's lots of opportunities to learn about limber pine. So it has quite an interesting elevation range in the crown in BC. It's from the valley bottoms, like the Columbia Valley bottom, all the way up to 1,700 meters. In Banff National Park, which is outside the crown, it gets up even higher, almost to 1,900 meters. Like whitebark, it's a very poor competitor and long-lived and high ecological value. So what's going on with these trees? Well, limber pine, the habitat is in BC tends to be somewhat inaccessible, and also very south-facing aspects, and not a lot of fire going on, but I'll get into that in a moment. We do have mountain pine beetle happening. So mountain pine beetle are, of course, a native insect, but climate may be increasing their epidemics, and they're hitting limber pine and whitebark pine as well. But the major disturbance agent now seems to be blister rust, which is an introduced disease, came from, well, originally from Siberia, and then it's been slowly but surely taking out whitebark and limber pine. It's an airborne fungus. It can travel hundreds of kilometers, and these trees have very low natural resistance, although there is a little bit out there. And there's really no known cure. There's no silver bullet. And so we have a lot of stands in the crown and in the western Kootenays as well that look like this, where you'll see some old dead snags, and you'll see some current infection like on the lower right. And then you'll see some of these taller trees with dead tops. And a dead top is often a sign of a canker on the stem, on the upper stem. And this is a very, very common scene in the crown and in the Kootenays. Now this map, this is interesting. This is from Brenda Shepard from Jasper. And she found that the crown is the hot spot for infection and mortality of whitebark pine. So you can see in the lower right, the red is not looking too good. And then in her revisits to her plots, we're seeing a gradual increase. And these plots were set up by Cindy Smith from Waterton Lakes, and Brenda's remeasured them. And infections have risen to over 50% now of all trees surveyed. And so in response, the government of Canada declared whitebark pine endangered in 2012. And indeed, there is some thought that we should replace the maple leaf with the whitebark pine on the flag. What's happening in the US? Uh-oh, something just came up. I need to get rid of that. Okay, where'd that come from? Okay, USA. It's a candidate. Whitebark pine is a candidate in the USA. It's been a candidate for years and years, but finally, it sounds like we're getting really close to it, like the final step or two of it being placed on the list. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, maybe Sean or somebody would have a little more insight than I do, but it looks like it's on the verge of being listed in the US. Limber pine is recommended in Canada to be put on the list. The panel of scientists have recommended it to be put on. And this is what happened to whitebark. So we think this will follow. As far as limber in the US, I don't think it's being considered right now, but if I'm wrong, somebody can throw something in the chat. Okay, so what's going on with fire? Well, there's a very complex relationship between fire and whitebark pine and limber pine. And I'll try to get through this quickly. This is some research that was done both in the Bitterroot range. The Bitterroot range, for some folks who might not know, is just south of like Missoula, so south of the Crown, and the Cascade Range. And what we found was that the return intervals of fire, there's a huge breadth in the return intervals. Like in the Cascades, we were finding intervals between 9 years all the way up to 314 years. So very high variability. Mixed severity fire is what we can classify whitebark pine as. We can see pre-1900, most fires were non-stand replacing. And then when the Bitterroots were looked at in an earlier period, 1750s to 1870s, the same, non-stand replacing fires. But we can see there has been a shift in these areas, in the Cascades and Bitterroots, to where now we're seeing more stand replacing fire in whitebark pine. Okay, here's some intervals for limber pine. And you can see, again, there's quite a breadth of intervals where we're having limber pine and the sagebrush steppe, pretty short intervals, the same with the ponderosa pine where it occurs with ponderosa pine. But then we can get longer intervals in the Rocky Mountain Douglas fir. The left photo is somewhat of a almost semi-closed canopy with a lot of surface fuel. We'd expect more fire return intervals. This is near Canal Flats on the Kootenai River. And on the right, we have a higher elevation limber pine. And we're not seeing surface fuels. The trees are very widely scattered. We wouldn't expect a short fire return interval here. Can we even classify a fire interval in this sort of habitat? Okay, so back when I was able to work on the fire lines, I got to observe the fire behavior and the post-fire effects on whitebark pine. And what I was seeing was that a lot of trees were dying after very low severity fires. And at the time, those of us who were into whitebark pine and fire were just total advocates for more fire, because we knew the research was indicating that they were being replaced by spruce and fir, which are supposed to be less fire tolerant. And so folks like Bob Keene and I, we were kind of pyromaniacs back then, just advocating lots of fire, lots of application for whitebark pine. But it was becoming apparent to me that a lot of trees seem to be dying in low severity fires. And I was at a conference several years ago in Stanley, Idaho, and Sharon Hood and Kara Nelson, who are out of Missoula, presented good data that indicated that even very modest scorching is killing whitebark pine. So what's going on? Well, here's another bit of research that's come out. And basically we're looking at fire resistance from the upper right down to the lower left. So up in the top, we have like redwood, which is very fire resistant, really super thick bark. And then we go down, and where does whitebark pine show up? Well, it's third to the bottom as far as fire resistance. And then limber pine is just several above that. So this has all this emerging research has and observations has really tempered my pyromania. And then fire severity, as we've heard in the conference here, there seems to be an increase in fire severity. Now, this isn't unanimous. It's not totally consistent. I think there may be some fire types or regions where we don't have as much of an increase in severity. But for whitebark pine, we're seeing a lot of evidence for that. And Sean Parks, who was on this conference, he has a new publication out as well, indicating an increase in fire severity in the Northern Rockies since 1985. And a paper from the Cascades by Amberson indicates that the leading cause of mortality for whitebark pine in the Eastern Cascades is not blister rust, it's fire. So these are reasons to acknowledge that fire is not only a friend to whitebark pine and limber, but can also be a foe. So that makes it a little more challenging to manage fire. It's both a friend and a foe. Now, fire management as well can be a friend and a foe. And so here's just some suggestions for our management. I think we need to avoid and reduce mortality, especially of healthy trees. These healthy trees that have survived the blister rust may be naturally resistant. And those trees are our lifelink to the future of this species. There's a little leaflet that goes around to fire crews. It's pretty cool. Down in the US, Needles of 5, Keep It Alive, just helping increase the awareness among fire crews, because where we have fire crews, we have chainsaws. And if we can keep those healthy trees alive and they don't pose a risk to operations or operators, let's keep them alive. Spot suppression, if feasible, is always a great idea with whitebark and limber. Water drops, wrapping, etc. There was this one fire that we ran a fire hose way the heck up to this patch of trees of whitebark, and fortunately we had a road right there, so we could do it. But you know, it would have been a lot easier to get out all the tools and start cutting things down. But where feasible, let's go lightly. Here's an example of a fire we got to work on in Oregon at Crater Lake. The fire was creeping up in elevation to where the whitebark pine zone is, And I was resource advisor on this fire, and we decided, having known this area, living and working there, I knew there were healthy white bark pine, mature white bark pine in this area. So the incident commander allowed me and a partner to go through and look for these rare healthy trees and protect them the best we could from fire. And that simply involved getting to these wonderful trees and digging hand line around below the drip line of each tree. And we GPSed them so we could come back and collect their cones for blister rust disease screening and check and see if they survived the fire. And the vast majority of those 26 trees did survive the fire, whereas the neighboring trees, many of them burned, the fir, the spruce, the mountain hemlock. So that's an example. If the incident commander has resources like that, and folks on the ground, this is something that can be done even on the spur of the moment, given the fire behavior. So another thing we can do is reduce the ladder fuels. Again, these trees aren't good competitors. So let's take out the spruce and fir if we can, through the planning, through fire smarting, or even during fire events, if we can do this. And then post-fire, the regeneration of limber and white bark. Unfortunately, we can't rely solely on natural regeneration in probably most cases, and that's because we typically see low numbers of trees coming in after burns. The nutcrackers do the best they can in planting seeds, but if there's fires, we have a reduced cone crop, just like with the other tree species. So another reason we need to do supplemental planting is because we need to increase the amount of regeneration that is resistant to blister rust. Otherwise, most of the seedlings will perish from blister rust. So if we have that rust-resistant material, and we're working on that in BC, we have identified trees that are disease-resistant, and we're identifying more sources every year. Then we need to really supplement nature and nutcrackers with our own sources of material that is preferably disease-resistant. So promoting post-fire regeneration. Okay, so there are two documents that are available for folks, and so Bob Keene was the leader on these. Now, Bob and I have worked for more than 20 years together, and he is unable to be with us right now. He's actually on another Zoom right now, but I did have the opportunity to review his guidelines when he was ready to put these out. And this is specific to the Crown of the Continent, so this would be a great resource for folks to use. And also, Bob has a paper in forests that came out a couple of years ago. So great resources. So I'm going to summarize it now. White bark and limber fire regimes are very complex, and this really hinges a lot on that habitat that they're found in, and especially the surface fuels, which are so variable for there's no like white bark pine fire regime. There's no limber pine fire regime. It all hinges on what habitat and the fuel types they're in. The burn severities are increasing for these communities, at least most of them, we think. And then we need to reintroduce fire very carefully. Again, these are endangered species. White bark is the only endangered tree, only designated endangered tree in Western Canada. So let's avoid and reduce mortality of healthy trees. And if we can, let's reduce ladder fuels and also promote post-fire regeneration. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.